In these past few videos, we've been getting very comfortable with using the print function to output data to the console, but now we should learn how to take input from the user, manipulate it in any way that we want, and then output that result back out to the console. We also learned the fundamentals of variables and data types, so now we should also learn how to cast these data types into other data types as well. If we want to print data out to the console, then we've been calling this print function here and passing it a string or a variable to output the result to the console. But to get input, you actually want to call the input function. This is one of the reasons why Python is such a great language to learn, because the syntax is very straightforward and you can understand what the program is doing just by reading it without actually executing it. If we do want to get input from the user, we have to set the result of the input function equal to another variable. So say that I wanted to get the user's name, I'm going to make a variable called name and set that equal to the input function. Now inside of these parentheses you have an option to pass in a string, and this string will act as the message to the user. So for example, I could say like enter your, can't type today, your name, and I'm going to put a colon in the space just so it formats nicely in the console. And then this message will show up, and then I can go ahead and print this name variable, and this will print the result that we passed in as a user. So if I go ahead and run this program, you'll see that this message enter your name appears. I'll go ahead and type in Bob, and then it'll print out Bob. I mentioned before you don't have to pass anything, and this will still prompt the user for something. It just won't have any message to show. If I go ahead and run this again, you'll see that this cursor here is here, and it'll accept any input, but nothing else is happening until I type in Bob, and then Bob is printed out. Most of the time when you are using the input function, you want to pass it a message so that the user knows what they need to input into the program. So like I said, this is going to store the user's name, so I'm just going to make the message enter your name, and we're going to keep it at that. Let's go ahead and see what the type of this is. So maybe I want to change this so that we store the variable age, and then I want to have another one that says like enter your age. So if I go ahead and print this result out, and then let's go ahead and see, so it's going to ask me for my name, I'm going to say Bob, and then it'll ask me for my age, and I'll say I'm 30. Then we'll go ahead and print, and you'll see that it prints out to the console. Now let's see what the type of this is. So we want to see what data type is outputted from this input function. So we can do that by calling the type function, which we talked about last time. Go ahead and run that, and it'll go through this again. So I'm Bob, and then I'll put in 30, and you'll see that it's not actually an integer. So this means that the input function just stores everything that you pass in as a string, and this makes sense because you are typing in characters into the terminal, and then it's just taking that and storing that straight in a variable. So that makes perfect sense. But say that we want to actually do some calculations on this age, or we're having a program where you're writing in your salary and then it needs to calculate a percentage of your salary to save something, then we would need to actually store that as either an integer or a float. So how would we do that? In Python, this is called typecasting, and what typecasting is where you're changing one data type to another data type. So for example, you can change a string value that holds numbers into an integer, or a string value that holds a decimal number into a float. This is exactly what we want to do when using input, because we're not always going to want to take a string in. So let's say that I have a variable called salary, and I want to capture the salary that someone makes, and then maybe I want to take a percentage of this salary in a program and calculate how much I need to save to reach a certain amount that I want to have. So I'll go ahead and call this input function here, and I'll pass in the message enter your salary. And we'll say, just for the sake of this program, we're going to have the salary be an integer because we want them to have just a flat salary every year. We will go into floats later when we talk about like hourly wage, but for this instance, let's just talk about integers. So if we go ahead, and we've already discussed how when you print out the result of the input function, you get a string. So how can we cast this into an integer? Well, it's simple. You just want to call the int function, and then you want to surround what you're casting in parentheses. So the reason why I have int on the outside and not on the inside, because if I call int inside of the input function here, you'll see that it's going to try and cast this string into an integer, and there's no numbers in this string. So we're going to see what happens when I try and do that. I'm going to comment out these up here, and I can do that by holding control and then hitting the /. This is in VS Code, and this will automatically comment every line that I have up here. If we go ahead and run this program, you're going to see that we've run into an error, and we'll talk about errors a little bit more, but it's going to say invalid literal for int with base 10. This just means that it couldn't actually convert this string of characters into a number of base 10, which is what we count, 0 to 10. So if we move the int function to the outside of here and we capture the entire result and cast it as an int, you'll see that when we print this, there's no errors. It's going to ask me for my salary, and I forgot to put a colon here. I'll just do that for readability. I'll go ahead and rerun this here, and you're going to see that when it says, we'll say that I'm doing pretty well. I make 100,000, so I'm going to do 100,000, and then it'll print it out. But let's go ahead and actually, because this isn't going to look any different than it did before, let's go ahead and print the type of the salary variable. So if I hit run and I do 100,000 again, you're going to see that this is actually stored as an integer, which is exactly what we want. In the future, we could, maybe calculate a raise if we're like a business owner, or we can, if we're making a budgeting app, we could take a percentage of our salary and then tell the user how much that they need to put in their savings account to hit a certain amount of money that they want to hit for a goal or something. Getting a little too ahead of ourselves, and we'll go over examples like that later on in the series. So I mentioned before that we can also cast into floats. So let's take like an example of hourly wage and set that equal to the input function here. And then we'll say like enter your hourly, if I could type, your hourly wage. And then we already know most of the time you're not going to make an even amount, or even if you do, since we are handling money, we're going to want it to be in a decimal form. So we can do just like this int function. What do you think the function is to cast this into a float? If you said the float function, then you are absolutely correct. So now if we go ahead and we print this, the type of this hourly wage, you'll see that it'll ask us for our salary again, which I'll just do 100, and it'll print that out. And then my hourly wage, I don't know what makes 100,000 a year, so I'm just gonna do like $100 an hour, and I'm gonna put a decimal 00 to represent that this is in dollars, and you'll see that it casted it into a float. Since we're doing like a money example here, if I want to add this $sign here just to, show like we're talking about money, and then I'll go ahead and comment this out with control / and run this again, and you'll see that it's formatted it a little better with a $sign, and then I'll say that I make, we'll tone it down, and then I make $10 an hour. I'm working like a part-time job, and I'll hit enter, and then you'll see it's still a float, but we just formatted it a little bit nicer to match our financial program that we're making here. I'm going to go ahead and comment out the work that we've done up here, and then we're going to talk about casting things to strings. So typecasting isn't limited to casting strings to integers or floats. You can actually cast numbers or Booleans to strings. So if I go ahead and say that I have a variable x and I have that set to 12, and then we'll have a y, or we'll have like pi here, and we set that to 3.14, we can go ahead and do like x underscore str, and we can actually cast this into a string. So how do we do that? We do the str function, and this is just short for string. And you're going to see that it wants us to pass an object. This can be anything. So we'll go ahead and pass x, and then maybe we want to store pi as a string. So I have like pi underscore str, and then I call the str function and pass in pi. Now if we go ahead and print the type of x, and then if I want to separate this with a comma, all this does with the print function is it just spaces each thing that you're passing in with a space in the output. So it's really nice if you want to just print values out to the console, but you don't want to have to space them out automatically, you can just pass a comma in and it'll just do it by itself. So then now that we have the type of x, let's go ahead and pass the type of x underscore str, and then we'll do the same with the pi. So we'll print the type of pi, and then we'll print the type of pi underscore str, and then let's see what the output is here. So if we go ahead and run this, you'll see that the type of x is a integer, which we know because there's no decimal. And then when we casted it into a string using the str function, you can see that it changed the type to a string. Same deal with the pi. It was a float because 3.14, and then we used the string function and it casted it to a string. You can also do this with Booleans as well. So if we go down here and we have a variable called, we'll just do like is sunny, and I set that to true, and then I can do like is sunny underscore str and set that to the string function, and I pass it is sunny, and then we'll go ahead and do the same thing that we did up there. I will get the type of is sunny, and then I will separate it with a comma, and then I'll get the type of is sunny string. And then let's do it, and you'll see that down here, this latest output said that the class was a bool because it is a bool here. And then when we cast it to a string, you can see that it did it as a string. Now you may be wondering, what's the output of this going to be when we print a Boolean as a string? Well, it's not very exciting. It's just going to be, the string representation of what a Boolean is. So it's just going to be true, but it'll be in quotation marks. Like we had earlier where we could cast a bools into strings, we can actually cast strings into bools. So you'll go ahead and see if I have like is raining, and I set that equal to the string value of false, and you want to make sure that you have a capital F here because that's going to match what a bool is in Python. And then I go ahead and cast this to a bool. So if I do is raining, and I'm going to do like a bool here and set this to the bool function and pass it is raining, and then we'll go ahead and print the type just to check that we're doing it right. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the output here, and you'll see that it started off as a string and then it was casted into a bool. A lot of the times you probably won't be casting strings to Booleans, but this function is there if you do want to do that. An example of a time that you might want to do this is if you are reading a text file or any other file that's holding information that you need for your program, maybe settings or something. Whenever you read data in from a file, by default it keeps it as a string, just like the input function, and you might want to cast the input into the necessary data types that you're going to need to be able to use it in your program. Like I mentioned before, I don't use this very much, but this is there for you if you do need to use it in the future, and it is useful to have. For the purposes of what we were going over in this video, we only really needed to talk about casting to integers, floats, strings, and bools, but it is important to note that you can also cast to lists, dictionaries, and tuples. I'm not going to talk about that in this video because we haven't gone over in more detail lists, dictionaries, or tuples, but I do just want to make sure that you guys understand that this is a feature, and we will be talking about this when we go more in depth about those other data types. In this video, we've gone over taking input from the user, which is going to help make your programs more user-friendly and interactive. And we've also learned about storing the correct data types in our variables when we do deal with taking input from a user. We're going to extend our little mock financial problem in the next video when we talk about mathematical operators, because this is going to give us even more functionality, and it's going to start to give us this little introduction into how to deal with math in Python.